Curious Lloyd.
We all have daily reminders that our life is very short and precious. Hopefully, you'll meet your maker at a ripe old age after winning a championship bingo tournament. But death comes for some of us sooner than we'd like. Sometimes, there's no evading the Grim Reaper. But other times, whether through luck or skill, someone drops the mic on death's ass and sends him home with a scythe between his legs. A serial killer target used her keys to deflect a gunshot to the head. You don't get a name like the Night Stalker without being a good murderer. Indeed, Richard Ramirez killed at least 13 people in a little over a year in the mid-80s, which is pretty successful, if you're inclined to call such things successes. That's what makes the slip-up, which partially led to his conviction, all the more bizarre. One night, when Ramirez was out stalking, he encountered Maria Hernandez and followed her to her car and then to her apartment. Hernandez turned around when she heard noises behind her, which Ramirez took as a cue to shoot her in the face. But when he fired his gun, the bullet was blocked by the car keys that Hernandez was incredibly luckily still holding. It's not known what kind of metal is used to both make keys and block bullets. Despite suffering only a broken finger, Hernandez dropped to the floor and played dead. After delivering a few good kicks to what he believed to be a corpse just for fun, Ramirez stepped over Hernandez and entered her apartment, where her roommate met a decidedly less fortunate fate. Hernandez got up and managed to get to the front of the building right as Ramirez was leaving, at which point she begged him not to shoot her again, and he didn't for some reason. Probably because he needed a pants change more than he needed murder, especially after seeing what he had. He had every reason to believe she was a ghost. This turned out to be a bad move, as Hernandez's testimony later helped secure him a one-way trip to the gas chamber. If you're intrigued more by the man himself, take a look at the documentary I made on Richard Ramirez. A family survived for 38 days in the middle of the ocean using enemas. One day in 1971, 10-year-old Neil Robinson asked his father why they couldn't just take off on an adventure and go sailing around the world. Instead of explaining the many reasons they shouldn't do that, the senior Robinson immediately sold the family's farm and prepared to take off from the coast of England in a 43-foot schooner, directly into a raging storm. It went about as well as you'd think. Actually, it went reasonably well for a while. The family made it over a year and nearly to Central America before they ran into trouble. At that point, because God doesn't like it when you defy him and succeed, they were struck by some passing killer whales and their ship was sunk. In most stories, that would be the end of the Robinson family, but they proved to be a crafty bunch. After solving the most immediate problem by clawing into the relative safety of the boat's rubber dinghy, they took stock of the situation and determined they had enough water for 10 days and food for even fewer. In the middle of the ocean, the math didn't look so good, so they took one of their paddles and shoved it into a spear, which they used to stab turtles and sharks and drank their blood to stay hydrated. When this feat somehow failed to give them superpowers, the Robinson matriarch, who used to be a nurse, collected rainwater and fashioned the rubber rings of a ladder into enema tubes, which everyone could use to ingest rainwater they collected. Now you see, the rainwater wasn't too good to drink, as the boat was not only filled with survivors, but also tons of turtle blood and viscera. That little trick kept the family going through the final leg of their ordeal, and they were finally rescued by a Japanese ship after 38 disgusting days. An acrobat survived the Hindenburg disaster. Acrobatics isn't exactly a transferable skill. It's only really good for two things: yoga and acrobating. It seems it can also be good for escaping an exploding aircraft, as performer Joseph Spa learned aboard a little vessel called the Hindenburg. Spa was relaxing in the airship's lounge, chatting with fellow passengers, and excited to be minutes away from reuniting with his wife when things started going wrong. As the ship went down, Spa sprang into action, breaking and climbing out of a window, but that was about as far as he had planned ahead. There weren't many good options. On one side, there was a fiery death, on the other, a 40-foot drop. After procrastinating over it for a bit, the man who bears to mention at one point performed under the name of Bend Over, decided to take his chances on the drop. This is when a normal person would at best break more bones than they had in their body. But Spa's training came in handy. I landed on my feet, bounced into the air and fell on my face, as he described it. In other words, he treated the sight of history's most famous airship crash as a trampoline-based physical comedy routine. The force of the impact threw him away from where he landed, which happened to be exactly where the Hindenburg made its blazing grave. 16 people lost at sea lived off breast milk for a week. In the early 2000s, you could say the Dominican Republic was having a bit of a recession, prompting many to flee to Puerto Rico and usually getting arrested upon arrival. And that was if they made it there. Many of those who fled ended up lost at sea in the terrifying 100 miles between the two islands. Such was the fate of Faustina Mercedes and 15 others, who paid the equivalent of 2 months' wages to board a tiny boat to Puerto Rico, only to realise their compass was broken. The group spent a total of 12 days adrift in the ocean, and their supplies were exhausted after 3. For those keeping score at home, this means they spent over a week with literally no pot to piss in. Not that much pissing was happening, by the way. By the 5th day, they were so dehydrated that they could only spit blood. That's when Faustina asked her sister to suck on her boobs. Her sister found that, indeed, milk did her body good, so she passed some back to her sister, who then offered to all the other passengers a turn on the nipple fountain, and suck they did, for the next 7 days until their boat washed ashore, after which they were presumably unable to look at each other in the eye ever again. The real-life Robinson Crusoe spent his days training an army of cats. Robinson Crusoe seems to be a tale too outlandish to have really happened, but not only is it based on a true story, but the true story is even weirder. The real-life Crusoe, a Scottish sailor named Alexander Selkirk, was less Pierce Brosnan and more Jack Sparrow. He wasn't even shipwrecked, for one thing. He was abandoned off an island off the coast of Chile because his captain was sick of his mouth. For 4 years, he lived alone on the island, and it got castaway weird right in a hurry. By his account, Selkirk spent a lot of his time on the island praying and studying his Bible. Oh, and he also became a beastmaster. Spanish explorers had previously brought goats, rats, and cats to the island, and Selkirk made very good use of them all. Well, at first, the rats made more use of him, attempting to fashion a meal out of his toes at night, so he trained an army of feral cats to defend him. Do you know how hard it is to train a cat? The buggers don't even respond to their own names. A man with a devoted cat tallion is not to be trifled with. But Selkirk's real passion was his goats. He mostly tortured them, whether by hunting or simple foot races, which would end when he threw the goat to the ground. There's even some debate among experts regarding how far his passions extended. The fictional story gets the ending mostly right, in that Selkirk was eventually rescued by a passing British ship, but he didn't go home afterwards. Instead, the captain was so impressed with the skills Selkirk had learned during his marooning that he put him to work as a captain of his own ship, which is what Selkirk did for the remainder of his life.